August 26, 1346. A grey sky presses low over northern France, the kind that turns every colour to iron. In a muddy field near a village called Crécy, 30,000 Frenchmen glitter like a sea of coins. Across the valley, 9,000 English soldiers stand motionless on a ridge, their banners hanging limp in the damp wind. No one speaks. The air hums with rain and tension. By nightfall, the world's idea of war will be different forever. For half a millennium, Europe's rulers have trusted in the same truth, that a man in armor on a war horse is unstoppable. A knight's worth isn't measured in courage alone, but in the weight of the steel he wears and the pedigree of his bloodline. He is power made flesh, invincible, ordained and adored. Beneath him, peasants fight and die so he can earn another ribbon for his family's crest. It's been that way since the first crusade banners crossed the Channel, but today on this hill, that faith will be pierced by wood and string. King Edward III's invasion had begun like a thief's fire, swift, cruel and calculated. He landed in Normandy with 15,000 men, not to conquer cities but to humiliate a kingdom. His soldiers burned villages, stole livestock, and left smoke rising behind them like a trail of signatures. The French king Philip VI swore to crush the insolent islanders. He summoned the might of Christendom, princes from Bohemia, dukes from Lorraine, the flower of European nobility. They came in silk and steel, their armor polished to mirrors, their horses plaited with ribbons. It was less an army than a parade of vanity armed for Judgment Day. Edward's men were exhausted when they reached the slopes near Crécy. They had marched for weeks through enemy land, chased by an army 3 times their size. Supplies were low, spirits lower, yet the king moved with deliberate calm. He ordered his forces to dig, to plant sharpened stakes, to measure distances in paces and heartbeats. His commanders looked uneasy. "We stand," one asked. "We stand," Edward said, and so the English did what no sensible army facing annihilation should have done. They stopped running and built a fortress out of mud and discipline. Behind them, 5,000 Welsh and English longbowmen prepared their weapons. Most weren't soldiers by trade. They were shepherds, poachers, thieves, given a pardon in exchange for service. But they possessed a skill no noble could buy. From boyhood, English law had forced every male to practice archery on Sundays. For generations, village greens had echoed with the snap of bowstrings. A man who ignored that law could be fined. A man who obeyed it became part of England's secret engine. The result was thousands of peasants capable of hitting a target the length of 2 football fields away 12 times a minute. Their bodies were warped by it, left arms longer than right, ribs thickened like bark from years of strain. The French saw none of that. To them, archers were insects to be brushed aside before the real fight. What mattered was honour. What mattered was the charge. By the time Philip's vanguard reached Crécy, the English had already chosen their ground, a gentle hill flanked by streams, fields hemmed with hedges. It was a place designed by nature to punish arrogance. Edward positioned his men in 3 divisions, his teenage son, the Black Prince, commanding the front. Archers formed the outer wings, creating overlapping fields of fire shaped like an open jaw. Behind them, infantry waited with poleaxes and daggers. Ditches had been dug, stakes angled forward, and traps disguised under loose earth. Every inch of the slope whispered forethought. Across the field, chaos masqueraded as glory. The French host was magnificent and unmanageable. Heralds shouted over one another. Trumpets blared before orders could be heard. Each noble wanted to lead the charge, to be first into legend. Philip tried to wait for daylight to fade to rest his men, but his army was already boiling over. They'd marched 30 miles under summer heat, armor biting into flesh, and now impatience tasted sweeter than strategy. Then came the rain, thick, sudden, biblical. It hissed on steel, turned dust to soup, and bent banners to the earth. The English archers quietly unstrung their bows, slipping the cords under helmets to keep them dry. Across the valley, the hired Genoese crossbowmen, 5,000 of them, didn't. Their bowstrings sagged, useless as wet rope. When the rain eased, Philip ordered them forward. The Genoese advanced through muck, cursing in Italian, their pavesses, those heavy shields used for cover, left behind with the baggage train. At 150 yards they stopped, cranked their crossbows and loosed the first volley. The bolts fell short, splashing harmlessly before the English line. For a heartbeat the field went still. Then came the sound witnesses compared to thunder-tearing cloth, the first English volley. 5,000 bows bent, loosed, bent again. 60,000 arrows in the first minute, hissing downward like a living storm. The sky itself seemed to break. The Genoese were shredded, armor plates rang like drums, horses reared and screamed. Men turned to flee, only to meet the lances of furious French knights behind them. Count d'Alençon saw his mercenaries retreating and shouted, "Cut down this rabble that blocks our glory." The command spread like fire through dry straw. In moments the front of the French army was trampling its own. When the first wave of cavalry surged forward, it looked unstoppable. 12,000 tons of armored flesh and iron crashing uphill through corpses. But speed is nothing when the ground itself betrays you. Hooves hit hidden ditches. Horses screamed as legs snapped. Arrows punched through eyes, through mouths, through the unarmored bellies of chargers. A beast that costs more than a farm cannot run when its muscles are strung with pain. The great charge folded into itself, momentum dying in the mud. Behind them, the second wave came anyway, crashing into wreckage, then a third, then a fourth. Arrows didn't just kill, they humiliated. They turned noblemen into lumbering targets. A hit to the visor rang like a bell inside the skull. A strike on a joint-twisted bone within plate. Even when they didn't pierce, the shock bruised skin and shattered breath. Knights clawed at their helmets, choking on their own sweat and fear. Those who reached the English lines found no tournaments waiting for them, just archers with mallets, daggers, and the cold efficiency of survival. The ground filled with groans and the sound of men drowning in mud. The smell of wet horses and blood clung to every breath. Chroniclers said it was impossible to tell where armor ended and soil began. Archers ran forward to yank arrows from the dead and shoot again. They fired until their fingers bled, until their arms trembled. They fired until there was nothing left moving on the slope except dying animals and flags falling into filth. Among that noise rode a legend bound for history. John of Bohemia, blind for a decade, still wearing his crown. When he heard the French lines breaking, he asked, "Where is the fight most furious?" Told that the English king stood ahead, he ordered his knights to tie their reins to his. "Lead me forward," he said. "God knows the way." They charged into darkness, into the storm of arrows. When the bodies were found later, their horses were still bound together, the blind king's sword clenched tight. By dusk the slope was a butcher's yard. The Count of Flanders lay dead beside the Duke of Lorraine. The oriflamme, the sacred banner of France, was lost in the muck. Philip VI had an arrow through his jaw and had to be dragged from the field by his guards. 16 charges had failed. 16 times pride had met geometry and lost. The English held their ridge through the night, killing any wounded who tried to rise. When dawn came, the mist revealed what arrogance had cost. 1,500 nobles, 11 princes, thousands of knights, crows fed so well on princely flesh they could barely fly. Peasants arrived to plunder the bodies, stripping gold rings, prying gems from hilts, melting armor that had cost fortunes. The field became a market of death. The victory was so total that the English barely believed it. When scouts crept down the slope the next morning, they moved like men expecting a trap, but there was no enemy left to fight. Only silence and the slow circling of carrion birds. The smell was indescribable, a mixture of rain, iron, and what chroniclers called the perfume of sin. Horses lay with their legs twisted like broken furniture, armor half sunk into the mud. banners soaked in blood until the colours blended into one long bruise. Edward III walked among the corpses at dawn, the mist clinging to his cloak. He was not a cruel man by medieval standards, but even he was shaken by what he saw. These were not nameless soldiers. They were Europe's elite, the men whose names filled treaties and family crests, the ones who believed they were untouchable. Now they were sprawled in the dirt with arrows jutting from their visors, their armor dented and pierced, their rings still gleaming on dead fingers. Chroniclers say the king removed his helmet, bowed his head and murmured a prayer for them, and for what their deaths meant. Because the truth was impossible to ignore. Everything that made a knight noble had failed. His bloodline couldn't stop the flight of an arrow. His oath, his courage, his shining armor, all of it had been rendered meaningless by a peasant's drawstring. The entire logic of medieval warfare had been undone by geometry and repetition. In the towns and castles of France, disbelief curdled into horror. Families waited for messengers who never came. Monasteries were filled with widows in black veils praying for souls that would never return. The Count of Flanders, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Blois, entire dynasties had been erased in a single afternoon. The French court tried to explain the defeat as bad luck, treachery, divine punishment, anything but what it truly was, proof that their way of life had become obsolete. In England, the news arrived like thunder. A victory so overwhelming felt almost biblical. Church bells rang from Dover to York. Poets compared Edward to King David, but beneath the celebration was a quieter realization, one that no one wanted to say aloud. The war had changed the balance between classes. When peasants could slaughter princes, what did noble even mean? The longbow had done more than win a battle. It had rewritten social physics. For 5 centuries, Europe had been built on the assumption that power flowed from the top downward, that the poor existed to feed and fight for the rich. But Crecy had proven that mastery of a simple craft could shatter that order. It was not divine favor that decided battles anymore, but skill and planning. For the first time, a king's fate depended on the hands of commoners. Edward rewarded his archers handsomely. Gold coins, wine, even captured horses. But the truth was their names were never recorded. History remembered the kings and counts, not the men who turned them into corpses. They went home to villages that still treated them like labourers, to wives who could scarcely believe their husbands had slain dukes. Yet the echo of what they'd done lingered. Across England, every boy who touched a bow now dreamed not of farming but of power. In France, the humiliation cut deeper than any wound. Chivalry was not just a code, it was an identity, a religion of steel and pride. The knight's armour was his cathedral, his charge, his prayer, and Crecy had turned both into mockery. Chroniclers wrote that for years afterward, nobles avoided speaking of the battle entirely. It was as if the event itself had been cursed, a taboo no one dared to name. The surviving knights blamed each other, or the Genoese, or the rain. Few admitted the truth, that the English peasants had been better soldiers. Philip VI, the French king, retreated south in silence, his jaw still bandaged from the arrow that had punched through it. He rode past burning villages and empty fields, unable to meet the eyes of his own people. For the rest of his reign he avoided battlefields altogether. His crown felt heavier, his prayers unanswered. He had learned what every proud leader eventually does, that arrogance makes a poor shield. The battlefield itself became a kind of graveyard shrine. Locals called it Le Champ de Nobles Morts, the field of dead lords. For weeks, scavengers came to strip the bodies. Armour worth £1,000 sold for a fraction of its value. Jewelers pried rubies from sword hilts. Blacksmiths melted breastplates for horseshoes. Even the poorest peasants walked away rich, pockets jangling with the spoils of dead aristocrats. But wealth couldn't bury the stench. Travellers described the air at Crecy as unbreathable for months. Wolves came down from the forests at night to feast. When the crows finally grew too heavy to fly, they waddled from corpse to corpse, hopping through what one chronicler called a banquet of rank. Years later, when farmers ploughed the soil, their blades still struck against skulls and rusted helmets. The psychological aftershock rippled across Europe. Suddenly, every ruler asked the same question: if knights could die like this, what was the future of warfare? Armies began experimenting. More archers, more infantry, fewer charges, but tradition dies slowly. Less than a decade later, at Poitiers, the French tried the same tactics again, and were destroyed again. Another king captured, another generation of nobility wiped out. It took nearly a century, and another disaster at Agincourt, before France finally accepted what Crécy had screamed: courage was not a substitute for physics. For military historians, the lesson seems obvious in hindsight. Discipline beats chaos. Range beats valor. Preparation beats pride. But in 1346, that realization was revolutionary. The longbow was not just a weapon. It was a mirror held up to society, reflecting a truth too ugly to ignore: that the world was changing, and those who clung to the old order would drown in their armor. The English themselves couldn't hold on to their advantage forever. The longbow required years of training, the kind of lifelong practice no army could sustain in an age of plague and famine. When gunpowder arrived a century later, the weapon that had ended chivalry was itself rendered obsolete. A musket could be mastered in a week, a cannon could crush what an arrow only pierced. Technology had begun its relentless march, and the longbow was its first herald. Yet, even centuries later, Crécy's shadow remained. Poets wrote of the death of romance. Philosophers compared it to the fall of man. The old world had been beautiful: gleaming armor, banners snapping, noble ideals of honor and glory. But it had been built on a lie, and in that muddy French field, reality finally collected its debt. There's a story, likely apocryphal, that an English archer wandering the battlefield after the fight found a fallen knight still alive, impaled through the chest by an arrow. The man could barely breathe. "Who are you?" the knight rasped. The archer supposedly knelt, pulled the arrow free, and said, "No one." Then he walked away. Whether it happened or not doesn't matter. The symbolism did. Crécy had turned somebodies into nobodies, and nobodies into history. In the centuries that followed, the myth of the knight would persist in art, in song, in story. Painters would still show them on white horses, shining and pure, as if mud and fear had never existed. But historians would always know better. They would remember the rain, the panic, the shriek of dying horses, and the way the crows hung heavy over a field of armor. Today, the site of Crécy and Ponthieu is quiet. A few stone markers stand where thousands once fell. Tourists rarely visit. The grass grows over bones older than most nations. But if you stand there at dusk, when the light turns grey and the wind moves through the trees, you can almost hear it: the whisper of arrows cutting air, the thunder that wasn't thunder, the sound of an age collapsing under its own arrogance. What happened at Crécy wasn't merely a battle. It was evolution made visible. The moment humanity realized that skill could defeat status, that patience could outlast pride, that the future belonged not to the noble few but to the disciplined many. And so the day ended as it began, with rain. It fell softly over the corpses, washing blood into the soil, feeding the roots of new grass that would soon hide the scars. The knights who had ruled the world were gone, but the lesson remained: no matter how bright the armor, it will always rust in the rain.